I'd like to thank you for attending the keynote presentation for the Housing is a Human Right, We Can Make It Happen Forum. A team of Greening Greenfield and Franklin County Continuing the Political Revolution members have been working to develop this program for over 2 years. It's been a journey. The complexity of developing safe, affordable, and accessible housing in this country has more obstacles than we ever imagined. Every time we thought we understood it, we found out we didn't. The idea that everyone should have a home as a human right has never been a part of the United States DNA. Historically, there have been active efforts by both the government and private corporations and individuals to limit housing, to make it difficult to find, expensive, and of variable quality. This forum offers you the political background in how we got where we are, new ideas about how to approach this issue, and alternatives about ways that we can make affordable housing more available and accessible, and ways we can work together as activists and government officials to make our goals become realities. We hope you'll join us for the workshops in this series to get a more complete idea of the issues that confront us as we work to bring more affordable housing to our region. The forum is a beginning, it's not an end. We hope you will commit yourselves to this effort in whatever way seems appropriate for you and your community. Please sign up at the community action icon on our website to continue working with us on housing. For those of you who are from other parts of Massachusetts or from out of state, we will do our best to connect you to others from your region so that you too can organize to build more affordable housing where you are. We have a few ground rules for this Zoom, as you've seen. We'd like to have all three speakers make their presentations and then open up to questions and discussion. Please put your questions in the chat and then direct them to me. My name is Susan. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Susan Worgaftik, W-O-R-G-A-F-T-I-K. And with that, we will begin the program. I'd like to introduce Professor Brian Sargent. Brian's research interests include race and racism, economic sociology, comparative and historical methods, the politics of governmental reform, and urban sociology. He's working on a book manuscript that analyzes the Federal Reserve's efforts to implement the Community Reinvestment Act and the Truth in Lending Act, and how that led to the housing situation we presently have. Thank you, Brian. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to present a little bit on how we got here, although much of what I will say probably won't be happy history, but it's still necessary to go over. So I'll start with a trip way back in time to just set a little bit of the groundwork. So landowners as a group in general have always been a political priority. From citizenship and voting, this was a very highly gendered structure. A lot of times access to political representation or to be active in politics in general or governance in general required land ownership, and that was a lot of times restricted to just men. This dates back centuries, but it's actually only in much more recent times that we tend to find that home ownership as a thing is a central element in wealth accumulation for the broader public. And this is in general a product of the post-World War II era in the United States. Prior to this period of time, home ownership wasn't nearly as expansive, and the suburbs as a category of thing, for instance, were relatively rare. As a result, are the ways that we tend to think of the geography of the country, of dividing things between urban, suburban, and rural. Those concepts as a way of organizing populations wasn't really central to the way we thought about things. And I'll cover what that means in greater detail in a moment. But within this backdrop is this thing called segregation that plays a role from both in the expansion of homeownership through the GI Bill, which I'll talk about more, but also before that period of time as well. And you had this building idea that race should play a role in where people live. But that wasn't as common or intuitive as one might think back before this period of time, I'd say the turn of the 20th century. Nowadays, it's a part of our very language. It's what we fight against a lot of times, among other things, It's central to so much of what chances people have for social mobility, for just to have a life that feels safe. But this idea is actually a product of history, and it was a particular moment in history, and it can be built as it was, but it can also be unbuilt as we're trying to do here. But first, we have to know our history. And so I'll start with a few basic policies, and I'll go over the history of them and how they built these ideas within that define the ways we talk about housing and development and urban and rural as words and ideas. So the first policy that's gonna orient us is restrictive covenants. So restrictive covenants are basically neighborhood rules codified as recognized by law at a particular point in time. No longer now, thankfully, but neighborhood rules that limited, for instance, who you could sell your house to. It was operated under the guise that racial integration of a neighborhood could negatively affect the other houses, and thus other houses and other homeowners in your community would have a say over who you sold the house to, because it could affect them. And this is something that really that you start to see from 1908 ish onward, and it was pioneered by developer J.C. Nichols in Kansas City, Missouri. This is an individual who was immensely influential in shaping land use policy, promoting public-private partnerships and restrictive covenants, all in the pre-World War II era. So from 1908 through the 40s, basically. And to the degree that the National Real Estate Journal had an entire issue in February of 1939 dedicated just to the J.C. Nichols company. His fingerprints are not only all throughout Kansas City as a city, but the ideas that he helped develop were influential all across the nation. He was central in the development of the Federal Housing Administration, which was where we get redlining. I'll talk more about that in a moment. He was central in the creation of the Urban Land Institute, and he was central in the creation of the National Association of Home Builders. He was a huge part of the idea of, again, land use policy and public-private partnerships. And one of the reasons he cared about both of these together was because he felt that it was the government's job to make sure that certain regulations were in place, but they were best mediated through public-private partnerships, not straight from the government. He was relatively speaking, he was a big believer in small government. And with that, he also was a pioneer in restrictive covenants and promoting them and creating the blueprint for how they could be pushed forward. And that led to the rise of them through homeowners associations as enforcers of restrictive covenants. And these restrictive covenants effectively cemented in our national discourse, in our national language around real estate and development, around buying and selling housing, about houses, around what it takes for a house to gain value or lose value. He centered race and racism within that. And he gave us, as a country, the tools to implement segregation at this level, but did so not through the government, but through making it a priority and a natural incentive for every homeowner or prospective home buyer to think in racial lines, in racial ways, about what they might want to, about where they were going to buy, who they might sell it to, et cetera. So that's the first moment in which we start to see these ideas about race and where people live start to really build. But you also have it within government as well. And that's where I'll talk about redlining as a policy of the Federal Housing Administration, which was an outcome of the National Housing Act of 1934. And so the basic premise of redlining is that mortgage insurance was offered through the federal government. So a bank would give a loan and they would be a little bit cushioned against the risk of that loan defaulting, basically, because the federal government was going to insure it. But the federal government didn't insure it everywhere. The FHA, the original FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, who was actually doing underwriting these, would draw maps, and certain areas were eligible on those maps, and others drawn with red lines around them weren't. So that is the origin of the term redlining. And Black neighborhoods were frequently and consistently outlined in red, and thus not rendered ineligible for mortgage insurance, and this procedure effectively prevented any kind of development capital from entering these communities. For the first, I would say, 3 decades, only 3 decades, I guess you could say, from 1934 to when it was outlawed in 68, African Americans received less than 15% of all national loans. And that's controlling, you can, and that was the case, just a broad blanket across that. And that established some terms by which banks and the federal government established like a set terms that depreciated homes in Black neighborhoods, depreciated and established a recognizable set of ideas for why Black communities and Black neighborhoods were themselves undervalued, or inherently lower value, as a way of thinking about it. And so, but the idea of mortgage discrimination as a thing, that is the broader idea of mortgage discrimination, existed somewhat concurrent to this, and also exists now. So, for instance, the GI Bill was a significant driver of white wealth accumulation through housing by means of affordable mortgages that were available to white veterans of World War II. These were not available to Black veterans. And this led to a significant expansion in home building in suburbs post-World War II that were racially segregated. And this wasn't segregated in the sense of restrictive covenants or redlining. It was just, there was a different, like, Black people, Black veterans did not have access to these loans. And so these areas were just not, they just didn't have the money to build to buy a home in these areas. Now, once redlining was made illegal in 1968, 3 decades after it's instituted, and you can imagine all the things that played a role in, all the things that happened to make these communities less, to make them disinvested and more trouble building and maintaining wealth and growth in general. A new system of mortgage discrimination was developed. And so this period, I'll go through a few pieces of legislation that led to this. So it was made illegal, redlining and mortgage discrimination in general was made illegal in 1968 as part of Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, called the Fair Housing Act, the new FHA, as it were. But this was, to get it passed, there was what's known as the Dirksen Compromise. Senator Dirksen created a compromise whereby enforcement of the Fair Housing Act went through HUD, Housing and Urban Development. The problem is no one really knew as far as who banks were lending to, and HUD would have to use the courts and have to sue in order to actually enforce these things. But without any data, that wasn't possible. So the next step was the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which required banks to collect data so that on who applied for mortgages and who got mortgages. Now HUD might have the possibility of actually proving this, but they weren't really built as an investigation organization in that respect. And so what ended up happening is, there was a separate piece of legislation called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which primarily focused on stopping a lot of gender-based credit lending discrimination. And it placed the requirements for the responsibility, the regulatory responsibility, on organizations that were already regulating banks. So that would be the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, Office of Comptroller of Currency, and the Office of Thrift Supervisions, which was overseeing savings and loans before the crisis in the late 70s and 80s. That model was really inspiring for a lot of activists on the ground, and so they pushed for these same regulatory agencies to take up similar responsibilities for stopping mortgage discrimination, and the Community Reinvestment Act was born. As a result, you have bank regulators that are responsible for dealing with mortgage discrimination. But what you end up happening is the regulation, the discrimination moves from direct lending terms to realtors. And you end up with realtors steering practices, and you end up with a term that we call predatory inclusion, whereby previously excluded groups that didn't have access to loans are brought in, but only on oppressive terms. And so, in one of the primary ways you might be familiar with lately is subprime mortgages or subprime lending. Now, the funny thing is, subprime lending was originally designed as a credit repair tool. That is, you have bad credit, you get a loan that was not under great terms, but it was always designed to be very, very temporary and to be refinanced once you built good credit by making payments. But this was then weaponized and turned against previously excluded groups, predominantly Black and Brown communities, as a means of effectively forcing them into more onerous and more usurious lending terms, eventually leading to the subprime mortgage crisis that we had, that we've experienced in 2007, 2008. So within this, you have like these shifting dynamics from restrictive covenants through redlining, through realtors, realtor steering and predatory inclusion. All along the way, you have the same basic dynamics of race playing a significant role in shaping where people live and what their life chances are based on where they live. And I want to highlight why that is for a brief moment conceptually before we dive back into the more fine-grained history real quick. So segregation doesn't just come from a sense of antipathy, but works to enrich certain communities at the expense of other communities. In terms of racial segregation, white communities at the expense of non-white communities. And one of the ways you can see that that works is, for instance, white homebuyers don't have to compete with equally qualified Black homebuyers in white neighborhoods. So the cost of buying a house actually goes down for them. And this also applies to renters. Black home buyers, on the other hand, are restricted to certain neighborhoods, regardless of their qualifications. And so they have to compete in smaller areas, which artificially raises the price of housing there, and which makes it more expensive. But they also have to compete with white home buyers and in some cases, renters who are willing to gentrify in those Black neighborhoods. As a result, there's increased competition in segregated neighborhoods and artificially decreased competition in neighborhoods that are exclusionary. And this works as a transfer of wealth, making certain communities more expensive and more difficult to get access to, and other neighborhoods less so. I'll talk about other consequences of this as well, but I want to highlight that this is really about like segregation functions as a really powerful tool for economic inequality, not just for racial discomfort or antipathy, or I don't know if I'm comfortable living around someone. All of that interpersonal stuff is secondary when it comes to building these massive systems of restrictive covenants and redlining, et cetera. It's markets that matter a great deal. But all of this falls under the guise of things we have as these ideas about what the urban is. I want to talk for a moment about the differences and the consequences of thinking about these things from an urban lens and rather than thinking about these things from a rural lens. So for instance, tax incentive affordable housing is everywhere as part of a larger privatization initiatives, but regulation is lacking and maintenance is oftentimes theoretical. A lot of times, so in this case, a lot of the same problems that you might have in Boston, you'll also have in Western Mass. So for instance, public housing and affordable housing that is built through tax incentives, a lot of times is the focus of regulation stops once it's built, and maintenance becomes a more challenging structure. And you can see this, a most drastic example is in the classic public housing projects that were built in the 60s and 50s on forward, where maintenance was just never really budgeted in, and significant challenges remain. And no really thought was put into how people would use the structure. An example of that is no bathrooms on the first floor for playing children. So when 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds can't make it all the way upstairs and they end up wetting themselves, the idea of the entire building becomes pathologized as a place of filth. As opposed to just having a sense that if you want to build a community and put hundreds of people in space with children, you might want to have the ground floor be a space where people can congregate without having to sprint upstairs or when the elevator is broken, up 12 flights of stairs to use the bathroom when you're 6 years old. Those same kinds of dynamics also work in rural areas. But many of the things that are central in urban politics have different kinds of rural consequences as well. And this is especially at the federal level where there isn't really a significant distinguishing mechanism between the two. So much of our housing policy is based around a land scarcity model that presupposes a certain kinds of density and ignores rurality and its own concerns. And you see this in the construction of community in terms of how do you build communities that are tight-knit with insider-outsider dynamics and getting communities to want to build affordable housing that might bring new people in that they're not used to. Over-policing is different in these communities. Employment challenges are also different. And these are just a few of the dynamics that are different in rural communities that at the federal level, for instance, there's not a lot of attention given. And we have to do a better job of that. But at the same time, it's also worth pointing out that across the board, housing's connections to other forms of inequality are enormous. And this means several things. One, for instance, housing instability and people that are unhoused plays a big role with policing. And so you see over-policing of unhoused populations, but you also see places where, for instance, large amounts of legal fines and fees produce housing instability by making people choose between, say, getting arrested for unpaid legal debt or going without rent for this month. You also see this play out with what's called a housing churn, where people basically go to live with relatives or family members, so that they can send what would otherwise have been rent money or mortgage money into the courts. And that also creates a lot of significant issues when the people that they're going to live with, their kin, don't have a lot of money either, and creates other forms of tension. And so that's one area where you have a housing churn that's connects to family issues, policing, monetary sanctions, et cetera. Health incomes and environmental justice are also an area where housing plays a big role. So you have asthma and pollution, but you also have water quality from Flint, but also through in other communities, say pipelines in Dakota, for instance, that can leak toxins and then pollute waters that are used for both farming and also just for drinking. Housing has challenges with employment. Where you can afford to live is very different from where you can actually find a job. And this can create massive inequalities in terms of how far one drives, the expense of moving around, the centrality of needing a car, and just like the cost of of spending so much time isolated in a car instead of with one's community, or spending more time at work. The housing creates issues of tax base, especially when tax base plays a role in education and education funding. On top of that, education itself is deeply tied to where one lives. All of these are any other forms of inequalities that are deeply tied to housing. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it's critically important that we start to separate housing from wealth and income as a political goal. I believe that affordable housing and public housing are not just charity, are not just welfare. And yes, it is a human right, but it's also a community good. It is not just a mechanism to produce or reduce suffering. It makes a difference in how a community is built and whether community thrives or whether community barely gets by or dies. The scale of the problem varies, but what remains consistent is the lack of political will to address it. There's a lack of housing. It isn't a technical matter unless and until we shackle it to wealth and markets. Then it gets complicated. And then we have to start trying to figure out how many people we can accept being left unhoused or in housing unstable situations to balance market concerns. When we actually start to just break down to the very basics level of, can we build housing for people? It's the affordable within affordable housing that ties it to markets, that makes it a political matter. But we know how to do it. The question is, can we build communities that are willing and ready to do so, and are willing and ready to embrace and to rethink their ideas of community, irrespective of these long histories of gendered, racial, and classist notions of what it means to build a home and what it means to build a community. And so I'm going to stop there and I'll pass it back. But those are my last thoughts. Thank you.
Wow. Brian, thank you. I think, we asked you to do a lot in a little bit of time, and you have done that, and we truly appreciate it. And I know that there are going to be questions around this. Linda Dunleavy, who is the executive director of the Franklin Council of Regional Governments, is among us today, but due to the fact that she had her second COVID vaccine shot yesterday and is feeling a bit under the weather, she has asked Gina Govoni to do the presentation. Gina has dedicated her career to improving access to affordable housing. In her current role as Executive Director of Franklin County Housing and Redevelopment Authority, she oversees approximately 260 units of rental property. Rural Development Incorporation, which is a nonprofit subsidiary of HRA and develops private affordable housing units. The Administration of Federal and State Housing Vouchers, counseling and educational services, homelessness prevention programs, and community development block grant programs throughout the region. Prior to this position, she held leadership positions at Wayfinders in Springfield and the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and served as the governor's appointee to the Natick Housing Authority. Gina earned her BA from UMass Amherst and her MBA from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis. Gina, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. And before I get started, I just want to say that it's so nice to be here among this community. And this is one of the things I love about Franklin County, that there are so many people who are willing to dedicate some of the time on their Saturday mornings to talk about this important issue, learn a little bit more, and hopefully mobilize. So so thank you. Now, bear with me while I get this screen share started. Okay, can I get a thumbs up, Susan, if you can see the screen? Great, okay. Okay, and Linda, I hope you're feeling well, and I hope I do this justice. So my focus today is really trying to bring into focus the issues of the housing crisis here in Franklin County. We're going to look at why housing is so unaffordable, some of the difficulties in developing, and then I'm going to try to end on an up note and leave you with some recommendations and solutions. So let's see. Okay. So the first slide you see here is about affordability, and these numbers are specific to Franklin County. The two darker bars that you see here at the top and then right here show the income needed to buy and the income needed to rent the average priced home and rental unit in Franklin County. So as you can see, there are many folks here who are below these income lines who simply cannot afford to buy. Even families at the median income in Franklin County, for those families at the median, homeownership is out of reach. So a couple of other factors that really contribute to the cost of living and the cost of living and housing in Franklin County. One is, I mean, I don't have to tell you guys this, Massachusetts is a really expensive place to live in general. But secondly, it's particularly true in rural areas. And as you can see here in Franklin County, most of the cost of heating fuel is above average. And this, if you look at this map of Massachusetts, you can see that this is really true in a lot of rural communities. So, you know, over close to half of Franklin County is heating with oil, which is very expensive. And this is one of the limiting factors in housing affordability. So next I have a tale of two cities, Waltham and Heath. While you might not think of Waltham and Heath as having much in common, what they do have in common is approximately the same housing cost ratio. So that 36% of gross income is the average spent on housing in Waltham, 37% in Heath. The big difference comes here in the cost of transportation. And this, you can see Waltham 18%, bringing the total percentage spent on housing and transportation to just above 50%, whereas in Heath, this is close to 70% of a gross income, 31% spent toward transportation. It's a huge amount of money. And as you can see, again, this is transportation is a uniquely, it is a distinctly rural problem. It is a problem throughout Massachusetts, but as you see, those greater than 65 and 55% in Franklin County, there are very few places in Franklin County, just a couple of tiny little yellow dots that you see right under the word Franklin, where housing costs in conjunction with transportation costs are below 55%. So this is a real issue for folks who are struggling, who are below that median income. So one of the other factors here is that the housing cost burden has grown from 2010 to 2018. And what we mean by housing cost burden are those households that are spending more than 30%. That is the standard measure of what we consider to be a burden. On the top graph here, you see renters, and on the bottom graph here, you see owners, and you can see what's happened between 2010 and 2018. Additionally to this, I want to mention that an estimated 25% of Franklin County renters are severely cost burdened, meaning that they're paying more than 50% of their income on housing alone. So one of the other things, and this is a legacy of the systemic racism in this country that Brian spoke so eloquently about, This is true here in Massachusetts and here in the Pioneer Valley. You can see that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, owners and renters, have a higher housing cost burden than their white households, both in the Pioneer Valley and in Massachusetts. So this is still true, very true today. The next thing I want to share is really about our housing stock. So we're going to talk about our people and our population too. We're not getting any younger. And while that is hard to reverse in the terms of age and people, it is something that other communities and other regions, particularly outside of Massachusetts, have done really well in terms of their housing stock. You can see here that 72% of Franklin County's housing stock was built before lead paint was banned. So that's a significant issue. 37% of homes were built prior to 1940. So that our housing is very, very old. That is one of the highest statistics in Massachusetts. And on average, Massachusetts usually is #1 or #2 next to New York State for being the oldest homes in the country. So what does this mean? We need a lot of rehab. there's a lot needed in terms of updating this home to meet the population needs that we have right now. So I mentioned that we're not getting any younger, and this is true for our population as well. You can see that the population in Franklin County has declined. There has been slow to declining population growth here over the last decade, and our population is aging. And this presents additional challenges, primarily in terms of accessibility and also in terms of the service needs of this population. We just don't have the housing to support the needs of the people who are here. It's a true mismatch. So in terms of key issues, we have a lot we can talk about. We need more workforce housing. We have that mismatch. Wages here are depressed. So even though housing appears to be more affordable than it is in Eastern Massachusetts, it's still out of reach for most of those folks residing here in Franklin County. And it costs a lot of money to build and to repair. Development costs are very high. They're even higher in areas of Franklin County where there is a lack of infrastructure, and local capacity is a huge issue. That means the folks who are interested, who are here with the knowledge to build and interested in building here in Franklin County. These are all issues. Lastly, I mentioned earlier rehab and the aging housing stock that we have here. I want to point out that one of the other issues is that with equity being lower than it is in other parts of the state that are booming in terms of population, it's very difficult to justify the high cost of rehab. So getting a bank loan to do repairs to your home or renovations to your home, or even just removing lead, is often unaffordable. It's uneconomic and it's unaffordable. So I want to stop here for a second and just tell you guys that I'm a city person. I was born and raised in Springfield. I spent many years in the Boston metro area, and I live in Northampton now. When I was thinking about taking on this role in this rural area, I stopped by and I visited this office that I'm sitting in now in Turner's, and it was on a Saturday, so it was very quiet, and it was literally just me and this deer in back of the office looking at me, and I don't know who was more scared, me or the deer. Despite that fear, I came here to this role because I believe in regional solutions, and Linda Dunleavy was one of those people. She's actually the chair of the board of Rural Development Inc. And part of the reason why I'm here. Regional solutions work, and I wanted to be a part of that solution. And also I wanted the opportunity to develop housing. So anyway, this is my friend, the deer. We're simpatico. If there's one statistic that you leave here with today, I want you to look at this, what you see circled here in red. Nearly 2,300 units. That's the housing gap that we're looking at between now and 2025 in Franklin County. This slide and these statistics were taken from the Greater Springfield Regional Housing Study, which was just produced last year through a joint effort. But as you can see, it is a Greater Springfield Housing Study. You all know my bias, which is that I'm from Springfield. And I can tell you as a native of that town, there's a lot of resources there because there is a growing population. There is more population, and it's often hard for folks, particularly in Boston, to focus in on a need here that's smaller than they see the need being in other counties, other communities in this part of the state. So for you all who have dedicated your morning, again, thank you for doing that. This is the gap that we're trying to fill. 2,300 units in just about 4 years. You can do the math, that's a lot of units. We have a lot of work to do. So in terms of what we're doing to meet that goal, one of the issues that we have, and this is not unique to Franklin County, one of the issues I would say with Massachusetts, and Brian spoke about the history of this, Massachusetts has local zoning. Each community can decide what they're going to do and what they're going to allow. And one of the things that has resulted in Massachusetts is an excessive amount of single family units, larger lot sizes, and restrictions on building larger developments. Those units you can see here, building permits issued in Franklin County between 2015 and 2019, only 16% were five or more units. The vast majority, nearly over 3/4, were single family homes. So going one by one, getting to that goal of producing 2,300 more housing units in the next 4 years is gonna be really slow. So my recommendation is that we look at building larger units and larger developments with more units so that we can try to meet the demand. This is just going to leave us at level where we are right now in terms of affordability. If we want to increase affordability, we need to increase the supply of housing, both affordable units and units in general. The next slide that I want to show you here is that equity in terms of access is even worse for the Black and African American community, and also the Hispanic, non-white Hispanic community. This data is 2017 to 2020 data that was pulled together by the Continuum of Care from Community Action Pioneer Valley on the homeless population here in Franklin County. The top bar that you see here represents the population mix of homeless, those who are using both emergency shelter, that's ES, and transitional housing, that's TH, in Franklin County. So you can see that if you're a Black or African American or a non-white Hispanic person, you're much more likely to be homeless. And again, this is a legacy of structural racism, and this is very true today in Franklin County. In addition to all of these historic issues that have been leading up to the unaffordability of housing, we had a virus and a pandemic that really hit this region, hit the whole world this past year. One of the distinct impacts it has had on Franklin County and other rural areas, particularly in New England, is this exodus from New York that we've seen for folks who are looking for clean air and space to breathe. While this is great, it's good to have more people. With more people, you need more units. So until we can continue to build, we need to, it's going to make housing even more unaffordable for local residents, again, with depressed wages. There are other complications from this influx of new residents, but ultimately, it would be great to capitalize on this and make a better place to live for all of us here. So these recommendations that are here are not new. These are part and parcel of the Rural Housing Plan that was published in late 2019, just before the pandemic, by a statewide rural policy planning committee that Linda Dunleavy led. And there are some really good recommendations here that we need to follow. And I know Jo Comerford is on the line, and I just want her to know that we need additional funding in the community scale housing program if we're going to make this work. There is a need for regional solutions. We do need to build capacity, particularly in housing development, in developers that want to work in an area like Franklin County that is often perceived as uneconomic, in some cases rightly so. And we need more flexibility in the programs that are out there, the funding that's available to build at the scale and reflect the community and the rural nature of Franklin County. So I promised some solutions, and I do want to share with you some of the good work that's been going on. In the upper left-hand corner here, you see in what will become an 8-unit apartment building in downtown Turners that was rehabbed using the Attorney General's Neighborhood Renewal Division. So this is their receivership program that puts in place a receiver to rehab a property and then rent it out. And it's done wonders for vacant and abandoned units throughout Franklin County. Next, I'm proud to show you this is the Sunderland Senior Housing. It's going to be known as Sanderson Place. That's currently under construction on North Main Street in Sunderland. This is an initiative of Rural Development, Inc., our nonprofit affiliate that I oversee, and Valley Community Development based in Northampton. 33 all affordable units with deep affordability for residents at both 30, 50, and 60% of median income. Only for seniors, just 33 units. We need more housing built at this scale. Also, we have affordable units being built at the single family scale, both through the Franklin County Tech School and through Habitat, Pioneer Valley Habitat for Humanity in Shutesbury. Awesome opportunities for lower income households. Beyond this, I want to close and just say that we have an awesome network of groups that, in addition to all of you who are here this morning, working to really make affordable housing available and increase the supply. We have local programs like the Leverett Homeownership Program, Greenfield's Housing Rehab Program. We have regional housing rehab programs available, and we have other groups like North Quabbin Community Coalition, the Opioid Task Force, who are working throughout the region to really address the housing issues and the inequity in services that are needed to provide housing for those who are really most disadvantaged in our community. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Susan. And if you have any questions, I'll be here through the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Gina. You know, if this were easy, it already would have been done, and we know that. So it's going to take a lot of work from all of us to make this happen, but we think we can do it. We truly do. I'd like to now introduce State Senator Jo Comerford, who actually needs no introduction in this part of the world. Jo has lived and worked in Western Massachusetts since the 1990s. And just to list a few of her accomplishments, she led a crisis intervention outreach team through the Center for Human Development, organized for 7 years as the director of Western Mass American Friends Service Committee, directed the programs of the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts, and led the National Priorities Project, a national budget and tax priorities research organization. And she also was campaign director for Move On. And of course, she's now our state senator. Jo, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to serve you in the state Senate. So that for those who don't know, the Hampshire Franklin Worcester district is 24 cities and towns. It starts around Northampton, South Hadley, and it goes up the beautiful Connecticut River and tees right at the New Hampshire and Vermont border. I think it's the most beautiful district in the Commonwealth by far, and certainly our constituents here are parallel to none because you are so tremendously inspired. So I'm really grateful to Green and Greenfield, to FCCPR for organizing this event. I also, in looking through the Zoom list, I can see so many people who are doing this work on the front line day after day, and I'm grateful to you for the efforts that you have put in, especially during the pandemic, when the state and federal policies just bore down so heavily onto the local level. It is just really a triumph, your work, especially in these last years, the last year. I'm really honored to join Brian and Gina. Your presentations, you might have seen me scribbling. They were phenomenally important. So thank you very, very much to both of you. I want to make 4 quick points before I go in, and I'll share a PowerPoint. The first is about the power of constituencies. I started by thanking you, constituents in this region, for the extraordinary work and your advocacy. You help us in the state level, and I know at the federal level too, focus on the issues that, like this one, that are so critical. It's your organizing of events like this, your attendance at events like this, your letters to the editor, your calls or emails or tags on Twitter or Facebook that call us to attend to these issues. And then your work throughout the legislative process is critical. And I do think that Western Massachusetts has a very important role to play at the state level. I thought that before I got in to serve you in the state Senate, and now beginning my second term, I believe that the kind of consciousness here, the values held in Western Massachusetts need to be felt by folks in Boston, and it's because of your organizing that they are. The second thing I just want to say, just to make sure that we're all at least on the page that I think I am on regard to policy, I think policy is nothing more than a choice. Policy sometimes gets rarefied. We think, oh, policy is something that's removed from us. Policy, you have to be an expert at something to make policy. That's actually quite not true. Policy is a decision to attend to a problem. It's nothing more than that. So we value where we invest, we value what we choose. And the same thing is with policy or budget priorities. So where you value is where I should go in terms of the choices I make around the policy I support or I introduce. I want to touch just for a moment on what both the professor and Gina said around the particular challenges of rural communities. What is true, and this has been something that I want to also tip my hat to Linda, that Linda and FERCOG have been leading. The Commonwealth really, as I think you all know, tilts toward Boston. That's been true long before I got there. It was probably true during the Shays Rebellion, which is why we had it, right? So it's hundreds of years in the making. But what's true is that there aren't policy solutions that can be seen as one size fits all. We do need particular attention to what rural communities like those out in our beautiful part of the Commonwealth need. And so, the kind of work that's intersectional with this, and I'll talk a little bit more about other intersectional work in a bit, that's really very critical when we look at housing in particular, is the intersection of rural policy as it pertains to housing policy. And then the last thing I'll say is that this is a complete inflection moment for our Commonwealth, for our nation, probably for lots of nations around the world, right? COVID exposed inequities that were present long before the pandemic and the economic crisis ravaged our state. But now they've been exposed, and now we have to look, and we have to build back better with equity at the core. This is an opportunity for us to right historic wrongs. And I take this challenge to us all very, very seriously. I do think at the state level, we have a particular role to play as we rebuild, but not go back to the status quo, because the status quo wasn't good enough, not nearly good enough. We have to go forward to something much more equitable, much more just. And again, it's a decision, it's a policy choice, it's a budget priority. So with that, I'll just share my screen. Susan, can you see that? I think you can, good. All right, so I'm going to look forward to this session. We're in the 192nd session of the Massachusetts State Legislature. But before I look forward, I just want to talk about something, one of many things that happened in the last session. but it was embodied in the $626 million economic development bond bill that was passed right at the end of the last session. And it was a piece of housing policy that I think of as a baton pass to us here in this session, which was inside this big old economic development bond bill was a policy choice. It was a housing choice bill, which changed zoning decisions at the local level from a 2/3 majority to a simple majority. So I just want to have that in mind as we go forward. It was signed on January 14th. So let's just talk for a moment about key housing legislation that's been introduced this session. And there are many, many other bills, but I couldn't name all of them, but I'll talk just about a few. The top one is introduced by Senator Jalen on the Senate side. And this is a critical piece of legislation. And I want to just say, in terms of accountability, I've signed on to all of these bills because I believe that they're critically important. This bill actually would protect tenants, current tenants, from eviction due to COVID-19 debts. And it states that landlords must pursue and cooperate with rental assistance programs. Right now, it's optional, right? If someone who is a landlord were to agree to participate in, say, for example, the RAFT program, this doesn't make it optional. This requires landlords to cooperate in good faith. The second bill by Senator Gomez is a new senator. He's hit the ground running out of Springfield, and he's just a terrific colleague. This bill, SD 2155, these will all have bill numbers soon. These are docket numbers. So when you see SD, it's a docket. They come in as dockets, but we haven't yet sent them to committees, although they'll be there soon. And then they'll have a proper bill number. That's something to just look out for. This actually really does a number of things. I'll just name a couple of them. It makes it easier to access emergency assistance shelters for families. It actually prevents families from being turned away because of lack of documentation. And it actually, for the first time, has this independent ombudsperson located in the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development. This is I think a critical role that's been missing in terms of how we are able to navigate what is a very complex system. Certainly state offices should and can help navigate, and certainly housing authorities navigate this every second. But this is actually someone whose main focus will be the welfare of Commonwealth residents. The next is this is Senator Lovely introduced this. This is actually a very simple bill. It simply says that the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program is core to be able currently to afford rental units, and it reduces the tenant's share from 40% to 30%. And boy, all you have to do is look at Gina's slides and Linda's slides to understand why this is critical in terms of affordability. And then the next bill is a bill introduced by Senator DiDomenico. He's a great housing advocate, has been for years. This is exceedingly important. It actually requires legal representation, especially for tenants who are currently low income. In owner-occupied eviction proceedings. So I think this may be widely known, but the majority of folks coming to housing court to navigate the process come without legal representation, whereas owners often have legal representation. And this just basically levels the playing field in critical ways, right? And if you pair it, say, for example, with the Act to Prevent COVID-19 Evictions, right? If we have legal representation and an obligation to participate in a program like RAFT, we have some way to move forward, perhaps more equitably, hopefully more equitably. And the last bill I'll just talk about, Senator Boncory, is an eviction sealing bill. So this basically says that tenants can have their eviction record sealed. It helps them in terms of acquiring new housing. So they don't carry an episode regarding eviction with them as a potential barrier to another home. This is a bill that I filed, actually. It's a local option real estate transfer fee. These transfer fees ideas are actually spreading across the country, not only in the Commonwealth. And so that's important for us to know, because many communities and many states across the country are doing this. It authorizes, so it's a local option. It authorizes municipalities to charge a fee of between 0.5 and 2% for all real estate transactions above a statewide median sale price for single family homes. And it just allows this again, it allows the municipality to do that in a way that makes most sense. And then all of the funds raised by that transfer fee would be used by the municipality to develop affordable housing as directed by the municipality and agencies within the municipality, or nonprofits working within the municipality. Another take on this is a great bill. This is a bill called, the acronym is the HERO bill, so the Housing and Environmental Revenue Opportunity Bill. The story of these two bills, the transfer tax fee and the HERO bill, is actually a very interesting one. So they're basically sisters. They're two different takes. We put them in together to be considered by the legislature, because in fact, it's not clear, right? It's not clear where the political winds are going to blow. So last year I introduced the transfer tax legislation as well. Of course, COVID hit and things really stalled out in most of the bills before the legislature in the 191st session. But in come really important environmentalists, and they say, hey, what if we create one? Because there's so much focus on environmental causes. Why don't we see if we can split the money raised by, now in this case, a deeds excise tax, 50-50. And so the advocates and the legislators and I actually said, well, this is great. Let's try it. Let's see where our colleagues will be interested. Let's see where constituents will be interested, and we'll see how far both of these get. So these are mutually reinforcing pieces of legislation. I see them as that. Jean, I heard you in terms of budget priorities. It isn't listed here, but I totally understand that the line you talked about is critically important for rural communities, and I really appreciate this. There are so many lines under DHCD and so many lines that are very, very critical. Let me just say that the top one here, RAFT, Residential Assistance for Families in Transition, I will say that what I've learned through talking to housing advocates is that our area, this is the metropolitan Springfield area, has second only to Boston in grappling with the number of RAFT applications in the Commonwealth. I think that speaks to a number of intersecting forces that both Professor Sargent and Gina talked about in terms of the intersection with the ability to create jobs, the intersection with transportation and the like. But it is really quite a pressing need for us out here. I'm grateful for everybody slogging through what is an intense onslaught of the number of applications, and we just need more money, frankly, to be able to get to people who are in crisis. This would also raise the cap on the amount offered to $10,000, and it would actually mandate data collection. So where do people need RAFT? Who are they? How do they identify? Again, so that we can more equitably target the kind of programs we need. Another is a program called Home Base. I won't go into so much detail, but it's really a direct support for 3,000 households who are currently low income. And then the MRVP, or the Mass Rental Voucher Program. This is absolutely critical. This is a rental voucher that's Massachusetts based, can be used by people seeking rental units in the Commonwealth. And it has been historically and tremendously underfunded, I will say. So I just want to pause for a moment and look at the intersection of housing and other policy areas. First, racial justice. Both the professor and Gina touched on this acute intersection with racial justice. There are many people talking about this across the Commonwealth, across the nation, looking at historic dichotomies between what white communities have been able to access in terms of housing, both rental and ownership, and communities of color. Also, there's an intersection, of course, with climate change. The legislature finally worked out an agreement with the Baker administration. So we signed a big climate change bill yesterday, which was quite a victory, right? A year in the making, many years in the making. Many of you have devoted lifetimes to this. But this particular bill was a year in the making, and it has in it a net zero stretch code. So for the first time, the Commonwealth would be developing, and this would be developed out of the Executive Office of Environment and Energy and Environment, a net zero stretch code that would be for a while an option for communities. This is a bill that I actually introduced that was passed into law as part of this larger climate bill. And so as we think about the way in which we have to address and solve the housing crisis in our midst, we also have to see the intersection of the kind of, I think, public investment necessary to make sure that as we build or renovate, that it's built within an acknowledgement of the existential threat of climate change and what we can and should do to address that. I'll also say that there's absolutely an intersection with public health. The social indicators of one's health or the community health absolutely are rooted in the kind of housing available for that community. So if we want, again, to build back better in the wake of a pandemic where a disproportionate number of people of color got the virus, got sicker from the virus, and died from the virus, we have to look at social indicators. And one of the key social indicators of wellness is where you live, the quality and safety and security of your housing. There's also, of course, an intersection with regional transit accessibility. I just am going to point to a bill by Senate President Emerita Harriet Chandler. And this is really leaning in deeply to regional transit accessibility across the Commonwealth. I co-sponsored this bill. Home here, we have to really lean in to support the FRTA and the PVTA, the Valley Flyer, which is the north-south rail, which is right now a pilot, but we have to secure it as permanent and help it be actual commuter or passenger rail. And then, there's a study that I was able to get in to really look at a restart of passenger rail along Route 2, and acknowledging, as people have said about the declining enrollment in our Commonwealth, part of the reason, or in our region, part of the reason is a lack of available transit, public transit for people. And so seeing that is one of the ways to bring population back into our region. There's, of course, another intersection here with public assistance programs and housing. There are lots of bills in to look at the cliff effect, which is that moment where you make just a little too much money and all of a sudden you are not eligible for some critical safety net programs. So that is something that we must solve. It is one of those blistering unintended consequences that has real human casualties. Programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit is exceedingly critical. I have a bill in that would expand eligibility quite extensively for this program. Of course, healthcare, of course, childcare, and so much more. And then the last I'll say is, our communities, in order to invest in affordable housing, our communities have to wrestle with budgets that are just too thin. Our tax bases are right now, for example, really taxed by funding our schools. I know that everybody here, I'm sure, values public education, but the cost of it disproportionately out west burdens our communities because of our size, because of the current education funding formula. So that has to be tackled. And then there are other ways that our Western Mass communities need to have revenue coming in. And one, for example, is pilot payment in lieu of taxes, when the state reimburses communities for state-owned land. Right now, because of a change by the Baker administration, that money is on a decline. But certainly Senator Hines and I and many others favor a different kind of incline, so that communities actually are really rewarded for stewarding state-owned land. And of course, that ties back to the climate change need for us to consider, right? That our trees are breathing for the Commonwealth. Our water, our clean water in the Quabbin actually is Boston's drinking water. And if we steward it, we should be paid accordingly. Our farms are feeding Boston. So we need to be valuing the kind of land we have out here, sending our communities the right resources. And again, resources, as money is a fungible thing, resources coming in for all of these different realities for us here out in Western Massachusetts will help communities have enough money to invest in affordable housing. And of course, the last is job growth. Folks may know this or may have seen this headline when it happened, but shortly into the pandemic, this area, the Springfield metropolitan area, so this whole region of the Connecticut River Valley had an unemployment rate second only to Hawaii. And that's because right now our economy is vulnerable. We don't have huge mega employers. We have a lot of small, incredibly dedicated employers, and they were more vulnerable at the outset of the pandemic. So I'm tremendously glad for our federal delegation's work on the stimulus and glad for what we were able to do at the state level, but more has to be done to solidify a job base here that is rightful employment with good wages, which again, contributes to taxation and contributes to our ability to make these kind of investments. So this is the legislative process. It's a little bit wonky, but basically what it says, it's 6 steps. So first, you all think of a bill, we think of a bill, the governor or another agency thinks of a bill. It's filed. This year they were filed, that's number 2, by February 19th. Usually it's in January, second week of January. And now they're en route to committees. So the committees will start to hold on the bills that I just talked about, public hearings. And the public is invited to testify. In fact, warmly welcome, needed to testify. And then the committee makes, in number 3, a decision about the bill. Again, your advocacy there is critical. It then hopefully would move either to a destination committee or out to the floor for amendments and vote. And then, of course, it goes to the other chamber, and then it goes to the governor. So that's where we are in the legislative process. Lots of steps to go in this process. So where do you matter? You matter everywhere. As I started, right now your input on legislation is going to be extraordinarily important. If we're able to get that legislation out to the floor, making sure that it's stronger because of amendments, making sure that all of us are tuned in. Input on budget hearings are critical. So right now, even as we move these bills into committee, we're dealing with the fiscal year 22 budget. So the House will go first, as it always does. So your budget priorities are exceedingly important to us. Again, many of you have made your voices known about both the legislation and the budget priorities, but they're very, very important. So it starts now. It actually started when the governor put out a budget called H1, but it'll go to the House budget, then the Senate budget. And by the end of the state fiscal year, we will have the fiscal year 22 budget locked. Before it's locked, it'll be a conference committee, and conference committees may be appointed for other bills, other pieces of legislation as well. And there's also advocacy there because the conference committee is really a statewide committee and should hear from you. So this is how to reach me. Of course, I put my my email and website into the chat, and of course, I'm available. I'm always willing and delighted, actually, to have conversations with all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. We've had a lot of information. There's been a huge amount of information that we've gotten today. And this is great stuff. We're gonna record this, and we will get it out to you so that you can see it again, because I know I need to see it again. And I've noticed that in the chat, there has been a huge amount of organizing going on already. So I'm very excited. I mean, anybody who wants to talk about the Polish picnic grounds, let me know. In addition, there were a couple of questions that came through that I'd like to ask. I'm going to start with one that's kind of general, but I think is important because we don't always have the information. What is the definition of rural community? It's not simply population. For example, Holyoke is severely depopulated since 1970, but it's not rural. So how do we do the balance of land, forest, and people to maintain rural and also support and invite people into the area? I don't know who would like to take that. We have no comers.
I'll say a few things.
Okay.
It's a great question. And there's no, I mean, there are some technical definitions of urban and rural that tend to tie not just population, but population density. But those are technical and don't really fit with how people live experiences are a lot of times. So what I think might be useful to grapple with this is first an understanding that these terms are always constructs that people just kind of deploy in different ways and and develop a life of their own. And so I would first encourage a thought that there's a difference between rural as a policy construct and a rural community. And I bring that up to highlight one very particular thing. A lot of the concerns that people in a particular geographic space might have are very rarely very rarely easily distinguished from the local places of density within them. And so the line between, say, Holyoke and a lot of the areas around Holyoke, a lot of the policy concerns, a lot of the troubles that people are trying to deal with in terms of housing, et cetera, cross those boundaries, even if density increases or goes down. And so I think they're we need to have a better general definition, but I don't think this disentangling rural versus urban or other terms works really well at a hyper local level. It works at the state level because the differences are pretty big. But once you get down to a certain level, the problems don't care about that definition. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't care, but I want to say that it depends on the scope of where we're talking. Then it matters a great deal because things that might work at Boston might work better in Holyoke than in other areas. But when it comes to what do we do, as a community here, then that varies a little bit more. That's more difficult to grapple with. So I just want to. That's my. It's somewhat of a dodge, but it's really trying to highlight that it matters, like where that definition matters changes dramatically. And again, it like a lot of the things bleed over and they cross those lines and people move between those lines so frequently. And in terms of especially when you have housing instability, people move quite frequently as well. And so even though areas change form depending on across history, so it matters how we define it, but there's that work can create boundaries that might not be beneficial at the very, very, very local level, but matter tremendously once we start talking about a lot of the bills and the dockets and the proposed bills, I should say, that Senator Comerford was talking about. So that would be my question, and that would be my response to that. But it's an excellent question, and I just don't know if there's going to be a clear answer because it depends on who and why you're asking that question and what the goal is in that particular moment, if that makes any sense.
I'll just add super quickly, and I was trying to read up to see the comment, but I just want to build on something that the professor was just saying, because there is a changing definition. So the definition depends on, it is density, it is sometimes density per square mile, but there is a greater awareness in the Western Mass delegation, and I think in Boston policy, in terms of leadership, I'll speak only for the Senate side, that we need to think both about rural communities and communities of what we call declining population. So this applies especially to schools and school districts. When we look at low and declining enrollment, for example, not as a rural school necessarily, but as a school that is seeing a decline in enrollment. And that translates into how we sometimes talk about communities. Communities might not be straight up rural communities, but they may be experiencing declining population. And that is a subsection, I think, of a rural definition that has been making its way, I think, necessarily into policy, so that the understanding of rural is even broader. And that's particularly important for Western Massachusetts, the 4 Western counties.
I'm going to move on to another question that came up. Could the panelists confirm that increasing housing stock should not focus solely on affordable units, since more market rate units lessens the competition for lowest cost housing options by those who can afford to pay more? Gina?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. I think we need both. I do. I think we truly need both. I also just want to keep in mind here that I think that the term affordable housing and the stigma that's associated with affordable housing, while I understand where it comes from, I think it's sometimes a little misunderstood. You know, workforce housing, when you're talking about workforce housing, we're talking about housing for folks that are somewhere below area median income, but, you know, probably working full-time often, and, you know, making between, we'll say, $30,000 and $45,000 a year. So a family of that income level still is looking for some affordability and some hopefully relief from the market rate. And I think that one of the things that we need to do is really understand the need for workforce housing and think about it in that way. Additionally, I want to say, and I think some of the stigma comes from a lack of services. Professor Sargent mentioned the sort of the disinvestment in public housing, particularly that it just hasn't been planned for. A big segment that we need support in are supportive services. A lot of the housing that we're providing, and I speak for myself, but I think I speak for a lot of folks who manage both public and private affordable units. There's a lot of folks who need supportive services, and the amount of money that it takes to really provide that level of care is significant. So I think that as we're planning to build new, whether it's a combination of market or it's affordable, we need to be planning for services and services that make sense. And as you saw on my last slide, we have a great network of partners here. We really, really do. It's about planning and making it happen.
Any other comments on that? Okay. How do we constrain the impact of real estate speculation and profit taking? Joe?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about that. I don't know that I have a quick and easy answer to that. I do think that the intersection of the kind of housing policy that's in currently, plus greater investment in market rate, and as Gina said, and affordable housing, and a greater ability of towns to invest, or communities to invest, regions to invest in affordable housing is not necessarily a constraint, but a response to private developers, right? We need a public investment that is able to meet the intensity of private interests. So that's how I would say it. I don't have a good answer for how to constrain private investment. I would just say we have to really, really significantly increase public attention and public policies and investment that is able to develop the kind of stock that our people need and deserve.
Thank you.
I'll add to that just briefly that there are programs that aim to try to constrain the level of profit that can be taken, particularly with new development. Just, thinking about the compliance issues with things like the low-income housing tax credit program, which is the main driver of funding of equity for the development that we have right now in Sunderland. There are limits like this, and there are developers who are not really concerned with getting to that deep level of affordability, who might benefit in the same way that a developer like RDI is, who's building 100% affordable. So I think that when you think about affordable versus market, you have to think of I think the goals and the objectives of the developer. And I think, your advocacy matters, and your understanding of workforce and affordable housing programs really matters.
Thank
I
you.
agree with that. Let me just add one more thing too. I forgot to say that the transfer tax legislation that I filed actually discourages speculation. And I can't believe I didn't think of that first, because it actually penalizes a developer from buying and flipping or multiple flips of the same unit, because the ability for communities to actually tax that or take a fee from that is seen as a potential stick, if you will, a policy stick that we can either benefit from through taxes that would allow us to actually develop more affordable housing, or discourage that kind of speculation buy that can jack up prices.
Thanks. Is there a greater need for affordable rental housing than home ownership in Franklin County, and multiple unit housing, especially rental?
I would like to respond to that. If there's one thing you remember, it's that we have a gap, where the gap is growing. The population is somewhat level, but the need for affordable housing is growing. If we continue to build one unit at a time, we are not going to get there as fast. I think that there are ways, and I think that for those of you who have not yet driven by Sunderland, I hope that you take a chance to look at that. There are ways of making multi-unit housing fit in with local communities in Franklin County. So while single-family home ownership may be a goal for many, supportive housing, particularly housing for aging populations, and housing that does not have lead for younger populations, there is a way to make larger unit housing developments work in our communities. So I think both are needed, but both please.
Okay, how about some of the problems in constructing new housing locally has to do with federal policy? Do you see any hopeful changes to HUD or other agencies in their policies under the Biden administration?
I'll take some of that. I am hopeful. I do not see hopeful changes yet, just because there have been a lot of the focus has been at this early stage on other policy domains, mainly coronavirus response and immigration. And so the kind of the air around urban HUD and other forms of development has kind of been sucked out of the room a little bit at the time being. But I do think over the course of this term, there will be some positive changes. And part of that just comes from the fact that a lot of the people that have been put in place by the Biden administration are people that are attentive to the data. And that seems like it's a dramatic thing, but it's that simple. There are people in place that know and understand dynamics of the ways that different kinds of communities can affect the life chances of people. That in of itself is likely to produce certain advantages, but what I don't see as being a likely outcome is the kind of separation of community from market. That it's still very much a market-oriented administration. And I don't see the kind of wholesale changes or significant changes that would be necessary to significantly impact communities such as these on their own. I would say that, so I think it's double-edged, I guess you could say. Yeah, I think there's going to have to be something more than an administration change to get to the point where we start to think about housing as a country differently. And until that happens, certain restrictions are still in place as far as what we can do. A simple one that probably should be on the books is just make it so that federal funds that are used on housing in communities aren't contingent upon not having drug offenses or something like, or some sort of like a offense. That in of itself would dramatically change the prospects of housing, both in public housing and publicly supported affordable housing, but would also change the knock-on effects of people that are taking on the burden of housing and unstable people that have been caught up in the webs of carceral expansion across the country as well. So I think that those are the kind of things that I think can happen, but the larger things I think are a little bit less likely.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that one?
I will just say, actually, let me just say what Professor Sargent just said about records, criminal records needing to be sealed, I completely concur with. And I'll just say there is a bill at the state level that would expunge records for drug-related offenses and seal them. And I'm proud to say that I filed it, and it's a good bill, and it wouldn't address all of the pots of money necessary for folks who are coming into our communities for affordable housing, but a lot, including state-related help. And it wouldn't then have someone have to carry the burden of their former record with them, potentially making them ineligible.
If I can just quickly add, I think, I have not seen the type of investment in infrastructure and development that I would like to see from this administration yet. I do see a respect for people and acknowledgement of the systemic racism in this country that I've not seen. And that's really, really hopeful. And I don't want to not acknowledge that. The only thing I've seen, and this was just out of this most recent stimulus bill, was investment in CDBG, which is a fantastic program for infrastructure, also widely used here in Franklin County for homeowner rehab. Specifically because there are a lot of homeowners in Franklin County that are very low income, and they to meet the objective of that program, they must be below 80% of median income, which is considered low income. I know there's another question that just came up. 60% and 50% are considered very low income, and then extremely low income is at the 30% mark. But when homeowners are at that level of income, there is public investment needed. So that is one hopeful piece that I've seen out of the new administration.
Patience, I know you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Well, it's probably getting way ahead of myself. And as a landlord, all of this is of one little unit, and I've been sitting on the edge of investing all kinds of other projects, and I've been watching the real estate market for the last 2 years. And what I'm wondering, and maybe I'm way ahead of myself, is how come mobile home parks are not used to house homeless people? And that was somebody in the chat was talking about how Berkshire County is, and I know Berkshire County has this huge amount of second family homes. They also have a lot of elderly housing, and I've watched what's happening in North Adams because I have family in North Adams, and I've seen landlords, and there are a lot of hurting landlords right now because of people not being able to pay their rent. There's a lot of houses going up for sale. I know of one particular landlord is getting out, selling everything because they're really hurting, and it's COVID that did it to them. But I guess I'm wondering why all of the different, there's rules in all the different states of the union. And years ago, like a whole bunch of states made it against the law to outlaw in each town mobile homes. What it did essentially is he was talking about redlining. It made it so much much more expensive for single family, for people to go buy land, put a well in, put a road in, bring up electricity, and do a septic system. And it definitely stopped a huge amount of growth in all of the towns where they allowed it. And I know, I don't like looking at the deteriorated trailers, and I know people live in them. My daughter lives in one. She bought a piece of land. It had 11 acres. it's so low valued by the town up in up in New Hampshire, that they only charge her for $5,000 of the value. She's paid her loan off in 3 years. She has housing, she has reasonable housing, and now she's building a house. So it was her way up. She's a teacher that makes more money than most people do because she's a speech pathologist. It's her way of home ownership. My way of home ownership was using the housing authority to buy a duplex. And now I know how important the housing is for my tenants, even though I'm not always happy with them. But I just want to know, how come in this state, day and age, with all the homeless people, and I love some of the stuff that Joe was talking about charging, about, especially, we've heard a lot about Hawley and about the land that's all owned by the state and how the town gets nothing from it for making sure that it's all unbuildable land. Nobody's, but I also know that we have years and years of programs that have prohibited growth in all of our towns. Our town in Coleraine has a lot of rocks and trees, and it's hard to get a septic system put in. It's hard to get a permit, so that inhibits growth too. On each end in Ashfield, it used to be when I built a house with my ex-husband, the perk systems were 2 weeks on either system.
Patience, I've got to ask you to get to the question, because
Building is
have one more-
prohibited all over the place by requirements that are to slow down growth. Shutesbury had moratoriums. All kinds of towns have building permit moratoriums. There is so much done all over Western Mass to slow growth, to keep the rural character, and not address even the 10 or 20% of requirements for low income housing to each one towns like Shutesbury, like all of the small town. What they said in Coleraine when I said I want this loan, write this grant so that I can rehab this house, was we'll let Greenfield take care of it. That's exactly what they said in Coleraine. And in the meantime, the house next to me got torn down. The house on the other side got torn down. I rehabbed a building. I provided low-income housing for one family and myself. And I have watched more houses torn down in Coleraine than rehabbed over and over again. Right now, there's 7 blighted houses you can drive by. I'm so glad you guys are doing this conference. That's all I wanted to say. And I'm going to watch every one of them.
Thank you.
Because I have friends with investment money, and they're really looking to invest in Franklin County.
Okay, I'm going to go for one more question or comment, and then we're going to close up, because I promised people that we'd try to be on time as much as possible. Pamela and Vanessa, you have your hands up.
Hi, thank you. I wasn't going to raise hands. I thought we were just going to read questions in the chat. I'm pleased to be here. And my question about the mobile home and trailer parks and tiny houses, the question, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is an attitude problem. You know, based on this need for housing, I live in a HUD building. I became homeless. I just did all kinds of things. I'm also out on a CHAPA, committee out there in Boston. So isn't it zoning, city council members, if you don't like the look of a mobile home park, build big bushes and hide it from people. But we have to deal with people that are out in the street and homeless. So I think my basic question is an attitude. Like, we can be as activist as we want, work our fanny off, but who's really in charge? Who's really making these decisions? I'm sorry, I sound angry because I kind of am. I've been working on housing for a lot of years now. Thank you. And then Vanessa's question is the same thing as my other question, the services that Gina talked about. We've got a lot of very ill people. They like to remain independent, and the state actually didn't rent an apartment, brought in a clinic. They have to have their sugar checked every morning. It's doable. You have to find out who did it, where it was done. Can we do it? You have to be willing to either have HUD or the state not collect the rent on an apartment so that it becomes the clinic that these people need. Otherwise, they're going to land in a nursing home, and that's another huge, big issue. Thank you.
Anybody want to respond to this? And this will be our last thing to close off the event.
I'll just say this is tangential a little bit to the last comment, which is that right now people can be forced into nursing homes if they make if their income exceeds even a penny over what is considered the limit. That's called, of course, the cliff effect. There is a bill, I have filed it, that actually would let people pay just the margin between what they currently make and what the limit is, so that they can stay in their home, remain in their home, and be cared for in their home. As they, again, they get to self-determine where they'll be cared for. There's another bill which would actually prohibit what is called a clawback from Medicaid. Right now, if you own a home and you have been receiving Medicaid related services, either in a nursing home or even years before, if you pass away, that home can't be transferred automatically to your next of kin, because the state comes in and claws back or recovers the estate, if you will. We have one of the most egregious, I will say, Medicaid estate recovery plans in the nation. It's in Massachusetts. It is devastating for wealth transfers. If you go right back to what Professor Sargent was talking about in terms of accumulated wealth. So that we made some ground in the last session, negotiating with Health and Human Services, but we have to go much further. I put it in the chat, those two bills, because that's one of the ways people can stay in their home and transfer their home without the state coming in and either forcing them into a nursing home or forcing the sale of their home to pay for the nursing home.
Okay, with that, I am going to bring this to a close. First of all, I would like to make sure that everyone knows that our next workshop, which is on April 7th, is going to be on issues around homelessness and service provision. And I hope you all will attend, because I think that it will help talk about some of the things that we've been discussing. If you will go to our website, housingishumanright.com, no a human right. It is there, and along with the other workshops that we have. We want to thank you all for attending this workshop. I want to particularly thank Gina and Joe and Brian for giving us the huge amount of information that we received. It gives us a real basis to understand what we're faced with, what the history has been, and where we need to go. And I hope that this has been useful to all of you to think about your towns, your regional community, to make those kinds of changes that we need to make. This is the beginning of a process. We will require work by all of us, obviously, to make any changes, whether that be changes in attitude, whether that be changes in physical structures. And to continue these conversations we've begun today, we have, again, on our website, there's a community action icon. We're asking people to sign up for that so that we can continue the conversation. We'll contact everyone who attended this workshop to follow up on our discussion today. And we intend to continue working on making housing a human right, not a privilege. And we hope you will too. So with that, I'm going to close this off. Thank you all for coming. This has been a really exciting and interesting event, and one that I think there's an awful lot of information for. Gina, do you want to say? No, you didn't. You were clapping. Thank you. So with that, we will have this recording available to all of you very shortly. It'll be on the website, and I'll also try to include the link in comments that we make afterward. Are there any last thoughts from our speakers before I close this down? No, we're good? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Elliot Silverstein. It's a
Okay.
technical question. You just mentioned recording.
Yes.
There's an option to record from your computer, but you need permission, or you don't want to do it that way, or?
This has been recorded. We're going to be uploading it into YouTube, and then we will be sending it out, and it will be on the website. So you will get all the options of having it without recording it yourself.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you all very, very much. This has been a great morning, and thank you for putting the time into this. This is really great. Thank you. Bye-bye.